Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us on this session, Resetting Migration, Moving Towards Opportunities. My name is Mina Al-Oraibi. I'm the editor-in-chief of The National, based in the UAE. I'm a journalist, but I was also once a refugee, and I am a migrant. So this topic is very close to my heart, and I think many people here have crisscrossed at different times, or know people who are dear to their hearts who have crisscrossed. Human mobility and movement has been around since time immemorial, but of course, with states rising, nation states, passports, borders, migration needs to have regulation. And of course, most people who are migrants don't suffer any troubles with regular migration. What we're really talking about today, in this 1 hour that we have, is irregular migration. What are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities? Therefore, the title, Resetting Migration and Moving Towards Opportunities. The UN's last estimates are 281 million migrants around the world, which is approximately 3.6% of the world. 1.1% of the world's population is displaced, and they need protection, and they are vulnerable. But also, host communities' security is equally important. Like all cross-border issues, we need cooperation, and we need governments, multinationals, and societies to cooperate. So, this is going to be an interactive session. We're going to have a little discussion here. We really want to open the floor to those of you who are here with us in the room, and also those watching us online. You can send in your questions and we will take them. I would like to introduce our esteemed panel, Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Very nice to have you here, Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic. We have with us Ylva Johansson, Commissioner of Home Affairs from the European Commission, and Veronica Escobar, Congresswoman for El Paso, Texas from the US. We had hoped to have Prime Minister Najla Bouden Romdhane from Tunisia with us, but unfortunately she wasn't able to make it due to the strikes today. So we will miss her voice, but I'm sure we'll still have a strong conversation. Prime Minister, I'd like to start with you to set the scene for us and give us your opening remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. Obviously, this is a topic of great interest, has been discussed extensively within the European Union, was a topic at the last European Council. I think we can contribute something meaningful to this discussion because Greece is a frontline state when it comes to our position on the external borders of the European Union. At the same time, we're also a country of migrants. We have millions of Greek Americans living in the United States, many of whom left to seek a better future in various conditions, were welcomed by the United States and are active contributors to their local communities with very strong ties to Greece. I think the way you positioned it in your introductory remarks is very important. What does it really mean to manage migration in these very, very challenging times? As far as Greece is concerned, in 2015, we were the country through which 75% of refugees and migrants coming into the European Union entered the territory of the Union. So we had a lot of experience in dealing with this problem. And also a fundamental responsibility between managing the borders as a sovereign state, but also protecting the borders of the European Union, while at the same time making sure we protect fundamental rights and make sure that we save people in danger. And I can tell you, practically, this is not an easy balance to strike. I think we've been committed to a policy which recognizes that at the European level, we need to be able to protect our external borders, and we need to break this sort of dichotomy within the European Union between those countries affected from secondary flows vis-à-vis those countries that place an emphasis on primary flows. And I think that as a European family, we've reached some conclusions which I think take us a step forward towards a common European understanding on how to manage this problem. The need to protect our external borders and assist the frontline states, more understanding for what it means to manage secondary migration, the need to have a framework to return people who are not entitled protection within the European Union, and how do we work with member states, with other countries to actually ensure that these returns happen. We've agreed many times that we've spoken a lot about returns, but we have not been able to actually implement them to the extent that we would like. What does it mean to offer legal pathways to people seeking a better future in Europe and doing it in a managed manner? Let me just give you one example. In Greece, we have signed 2 bilateral agreements with Bangladesh and with Egypt to offer people from those countries the opportunity to come and work within our countries, but in an organized manner. And of course, the most difficult challenge of all, I mean, the Holy Grail, how do we tackle the root causes of migration in the first place, be it climate change, be it conflict, and how do we help the countries, the real countries of origin, to offer their young people a better future. So this has been a very, very complicated problem. The Commissioner has worked very hard to bring us towards what is a European agreement. We call it the European pact on migration. We've made progress, but we're clearly not there yet. But I'm more optimistic after the last Council that at least there's a better understanding and less mistrust between those countries that point the finger at the frontline states and the frontline states arguing, and sometimes rightly so, that the countries which are further away from the border are not doing enough to help us in terms of solidarity. So my obligation is to understand, when the Dutch or the Swedish Prime Minister talks to me about secondary movements and how much pressure this puts on their systems, and I think the obligation of those countries is to understand my position, what it means to be on the border, having both a land and a sea border, having to deal with smugglers who instrumentalize human suffering. I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail, because in my mind it is a critical component of the problem, and we need to be ruthless in terms of eradicating these smugglers' networks, and understanding that we also need assistance, we need solidarity, we need support in terms of doing what is a difficult job. We want to do it with discipline, but also with dignity.
And that's the conundrum, the discipline and dignity, the protection and security. And so as Commissioner for Home Affairs, this is really your primary job, Commissioner Johansson. If you can tell us about the European approach, and is there now a united European position on migration?
We are close to, I should say. I could comment on that soon, but first to say, the overall migration situation in Europe, in European Union, is that every year we have approximately 3 million legal migrants that will get the residence permit in European Union. This is the big part. But then we also have the irregular arrivals, and this is, of course, really a challenge that we need to manage better than we do today. And right now we are also managing 4 million Ukrainian refugees that we are hosting. So this is a little bit the overall thing. But I think just to continue what's already been said, that migration has always been there. Migration will always be there. Migration will never stop. Migration is actually part of the human beings. So our task as politicians is to manage migration in an orderly way. And this is the task. And what we have seen when I took office more than 3 years ago now, we were actually in a very vulnerable situation in the European Union, because we were extremely divided and all policy making was blocked. And migration was seen as a toxic area, and that is really, really dangerous. And that's also what Lukashenko tried to use when he tried to instrumentalize migrants into European Union. And what I've been working on together with the member states since then is to calm down the situation, to look at migration as a normal policy area. Of course, we will not all agree on everything, but we can compromise and we can find solutions together. And I think really what's happened, what you told me about the European Council, is the same that we see in other areas, where all member states now are in a situation to understand each other's challenges, and that the only way to manage this is to manage it together. So we are pretty close to actually have a situation where we will adopt all the legislative files that are in the pact, and we are in a situation where there are much more understanding to support each other. But what I would like to add, it's not all about what's happened inside the European Union. Because to manage migration, we need to work with countries outside the European Union. We need to protect our external borders, but we also need to work along the routes. We need to work with countries of origin, countries of transit. Without that, it's not possible to manage migration in an orderly way. And I hope we can come back to that later on how to do that, but it's absolutely necessary. No member state can deal with it alone, but the European Union cannot either deal with it alone without working with partner countries.
I want to talk about that, the routes and the countries of origin and the countries of transit. Like you said, this has been highlighted as a major problem. What are the biggest obstacles in coming to agreements with these countries?
We have a lot of agreements, but I said we have an internal challenge. That is that we need to speak with one voice. As a Team Europe. We are coming closer to that, but this is sometimes a challenge because different member states have different special relations with some countries, for example. But also on the other side, it's sometimes I meet from my counterparts in the third country that they're a little bit afraid of really making deals when it comes to migration. And I think this is also part of that. We all need to have the approach that migration is normal, and we can only manage this together. And let's deal with different parts, because it has to be comprehensive. Countries need to take back the citizens that are illegally staying in the European Union. This is important. But the European Union, we are lacking a lot of workforce, and we should welcome both students and labor migration into the European Union. And of course, we need to take our share of the protection of refugees. So otherwise, you can't just put, that one should do everything and another one nothing. So we have to do all of these parts together, and this is sometimes a challenge.
Congresswoman Escobar, I want to bring you into the conversation because, of course, this is a global issue. We're looking at the European Union and possibly lessons to be learned from there, but also the challenge in the United States and the challenge particularly of smugglers who bring in different vulnerable migrants or those looking for a better life from different countries south of the border through Mexico and coming into the United States. How do you deal with it, especially as El Paso is a frontline state?
Well, I want to first say thank you for including me in this conversation. This is such a pressing issue across the globe, and you are absolutely right, Commissioner. In many ways, migration is a human right, and it has also happened. It's been occurring forever. I represent a community on the US-Mexico border, on the southern border. And in fact, my community of El Paso last year saw the highest numbers of apprehensions and encounters of migrants on the southern border. And in fact, folks across the globe might have seen photos of hundreds and at some points thousands of migrants sleeping in the streets of my community during 18-degree temperatures in December. We were so overwhelmed. Our shelters were at capacity. We had to create significantly more emergency shelter. And even with moving migrants into the interior of the United States, those individuals who were legally seeking asylum, we just couldn't move quickly enough because the arrivals were happening in such significant numbers. But you're right, those smuggling organizations have really gained significant power. And they have become far more sophisticated. There have always been human smugglers. There have always been those avenues for migrants to depend on others to pay people to move them. But really, during the last administration, during the Trump administration, with rapid expulsion policies that the administration instituted, the cartels in particular saw an opportunity. They saw vulnerable populations that needed help at the border, and they capitalized on that human misery and that suffering. And we have heard in my community, some of the migrants that I've spoken to, we've heard stories of some of those migrants paying upwards of $20,000 to human smugglers to move them through dangerous jungles. We've heard horrific stories in my community of young women who have essentially prepared themselves for sexual assault and sexual violence along the journey. And this has become widely accepted by migrants. The administration, in the absence of Congress opening up legal pathways, because that truly is an important component of the solution, opening up those legal pathways to get people off of those smuggling pathways. But in the absence of that, the administration has been trying to create their own parole programs, trying to incentivize moving migrants out of the hands of smugglers and into those legal pathways. There are challenges, though, even with that plan. Most migrants don't know about the legal pathways, or they are so limited in number that there's just not enough opportunity. They have to have a visa, they have to have a photograph. There's certain requirements they simply cannot meet. And when you are running for your life with the clothes on your back and little else, and you believe you can go to the southern border and seek asylum, it's very hard to get information to those very vulnerable people about these limited pathways. So we have a lot of work to do. I will tell you one more thing, one more detail that I think is important. The administration has done a very good job, President Biden and his administration, of really working to try to dismantle those human trafficking networks. But as long as there is that driver pushing people out of their country, those human traffickers are going to seek to take advantage of them and to use them in order to enrich themselves and to really take over these routes.
And that goes back to the point that if we don't have solutions in the home countries, it's very hard to stop it. But when we're talking about limited pathways, I mean, you spoke about the agreements with Bangladesh and Egypt, so you have a legal way of getting work for those that need it, and also serves a purpose for Greece. But it's always going to be a limited number. So what other solutions are there that you would press for and think that we could expand further on?
I think you're right that, of course, the numbers will be initially limited, but it does send a signal, and the signal that we are open to legal pathways from numerous countries, but that we will control the process, but give opportunities to people to come and live in Europe, work in Europe, at a time when we're growing older and we're facing big demographic challenges, and we'll be facing already labor shortages. Greece is a country coming out of a profound economic crisis. The economy is growing. We still have an unemployment of 11%. It's coming down rapidly, but we already have labor shortages. But this means a much more active engagement with the countries of origin. And the problem is that sometimes, you know, the countries of origin are not necessarily the countries that we would like to do that we would like to have bilateral arrangements with. But the Commissioner is right. You have an obligation to take back someone who has entered illegally, but at the same time you also have to offer those countries something in return. So we have a carrot and a stick. We have development aid, we have geopolitical clout, but we need to offer those countries something in return, because otherwise they will just make it very, very difficult for us to return people whom we have categorized as not being eligible to receive asylum status. And of course, countries of transit are also rather important. I mean, we have a complicated situation with Turkey. Turkey is both a problem and an opportunity in terms of dealing with migration. We did a deal with Turkey back in 2016. It's called the EU-Turkey Statement. It hasn't been fully implemented. Turkey is home to 4 million refugees now. That is a fact. At the same time, there is systematic smuggling taking place from the Turkish shore. I wouldn't say with the support of the Turkish state, but certainly with the Turkish state being aware of what is happening and tolerating it. Visa regime is also very, very important. How do you fly, for example, into Turkey? If countries that want to have a close relationship with the European Union need to streamline their visa regime with our visa regime. Let me just give you an example. It's pretty easy now, and this is actually a very lucrative business, to get a fake student visa from Somalia, from Mogadishu. You jump on a plane on a one-way ticket. You fly to Istanbul. A bus is picking you up. It's putting you in touch with a smuggler. The smuggler is in touch, unfortunately, and this is a truth we have to point out, that certain, it's a minority, but certain NGOs are part of this network, totally aligned. They know when the boat is going to leave. They know when the boat is going to arrive. So working with the transit countries, in our case, is also particularly important because, again, for us, we've managed to reduce the number of people at sea. The fewer people we have leaving leaving on an inflatable boat in horrible conditions, the fewer chances we will have that you actually have an accident at sea. And our Coast Guard, has saved tens of thousands of people, because we're constantly faced with situations of distress, because quite frequently these trips can become search and rescue missions, and then you actually have to operate under very difficult conditions. But you pointed out something which I want to highlight. We never want to be in a position where numbers overwhelm us. If you are in that position, everything becomes extremely complicated. When we came into power in 2019, we had both a stock and a flow problem. We had tens of thousands of people in horrible conditions. You remember horrible conditions. We had exploited unaccompanied minors. We had asylum applications that took for ages. There never was, a final decision. And we had lots of people arriving. That is practically an unmanageable problem. What do? We reduced the flow, but we also addressed the stock. We built modern facilities. And with the help of the European Union, now you go to our islands and they're state-of-the-art facilities, they're human facilities. But we also addressed the stock problem in terms of processing the asylum applications. But the problem is that in a crisis situation, we will be overwhelmed. And if a frontline state is overwhelmed, then the incentive to just turn a blind eye and just let the people come through and go through, it will be there. And then you start having border blockage. This is what happened in 2015. And then suddenly Schengen, which is such a big asset for the European Union, will collapse, because the countries will impose internal border controls within the Schengen area.
And one of the challenges is this push-pull factors. So sometimes countries are concerned that if actually conditions are comfortable is probably the wrong word to use, but they're not as bad, then people might be encouraged to come through. But at the same time, there's humanitarian needs and there's pressure. So, Commissioner, how do you see it about the balance of that human right and dignity, but on the flip side, not seeming to encourage further flows? And also, because of that, how do you get policies that respect human rights, but also ensure that they're not seeming to be attractive?
I think you can't answer that question in general, because it depends on who we are talking about. For example, when we are welcoming all the Ukrainian refugees, we are really welcoming all of them. We don't want to stop them because they need to flee from this war in Ukraine. But when, for example, if we see people arriving and apply for asylum that are not fleeing from war prosecution, they just want a job. Yeah, and this we should of course avoid people coming irregular when there's possibility to come on a legal way on labor migration. But I think really we have a big challenge, what you said, Veronica, on with the smugglers. Today in Bulgaria, they just found a lorry with 40 migrants in and 18 dead, hidden under some wood in this lorry. And this is very often the case. People are risking their lives and losing their lives through these smugglers. Sometimes they are just lured, they're paying a lot of money for these routes, but sometimes they also, when they hesitate to go into a boat in a dangerous weather, for example, they are also pushed and forced into that. So fighting the smuggler is really important, and one way to do that, to come back to this legal migration, because in Europe we have 1 million labor migrants every year. That's pretty much, actually. Yeah, and we're going to need more. that we can maybe going to need 1.5 million or 2 million, I don't know, but it's going to be more because the demographic situation is like that. And when Greece does this very good agreement with Bangladesh and Egypt, for example, a lot of member states do that, we need to it's a national competence to take these decisions, but we should have a European umbrella so that we can say to citizens in a specific country, there are a lot of opportunities to come legally to Europe, not only to that country, but we have together all these opportunities. I think this is the only way that we can compete with the marketing from the smugglers, because for many often young people, but not always young people, that are searching for better opportunities. They gather money around their families and neighbors to be able to pay the smugglers because they think this is the only opportunity to find a better future. And we need to be better in, so say, marketing the legal ways that we have for these better opportunities. And then we need more of a Team Europe approach. And that also paves the way because when we need a readmission agreement, we need it on EU level. When we need, for example, an anti-smuggling partnership with a specific third country, we need it on the EU level. So be able to use the legal pathways as a leverage to also have better cooperation on other important issues to manage migration with third countries. We need, and we are taking steps in that direction, but still we have some more steps to go.
Of course, tragic what's happening in Ukraine, but also some of the migrants that are heading are coming from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, where wars continue. And I think this is one of the issues of, we have Venezuela, Nicaragua. You would not say these are war situations, but these are people who also need prosecution. So I think that definition of who needs to be protected. And as we look to the future, climate refugees, the UN is estimating 21 million people a year now from 2008 have needed protection because of climate, and it's only going to increase. How do we work on the definitions?
And it's not just climate. There are democracies that are imploding. So we have a climate crisis. We have a crisis of failing democracies, rising autocracy, and at the same time, for us, what is different in the United States is we've not had the political will in Congress to modernize our infrastructure. We have very similar infrastructure today that we had in the 1980s and the 1990s. Not much has changed. And so it's outdated, it's expensive, it doesn't meet the moment of a very different type of migrant. And when you talk about definitions, what we are seeing in El Paso and in the United States and along the southern border is an historic refugee crisis in our Western Hemisphere. But yet, many of these individuals don't meet the definition of a refugee. And because Congress has chosen to address immigration as a border-only issue, using deterrence instead of legal pathways, frequently these migrants have one legal pathway, and that's asylum. And they don't qualify because they may be economic migrants seeking a job. And there's an abundance of jobs and work in the United States, and this population is seeking that work. And so it's almost as though we fail to recognize the moment, not just in the infrastructure, not just in the laws, but how advantageous immigration is for us as a country. But in terms of the definition, we really, I think across the globe, I wish there were more best practices that we could all adopt with regard to the changing flow of humanity. We are seeing climate migrants at a level like never before. Vulnerable people saying, I can no longer grow food on my land. I can no longer feed my family or myself. And so what do we expect them to do? They don't meet the definition of an individual seeking asylum, or they don't meet that standard. Congress hasn't passed any new laws to create more legal pathways, and yet at the same time we think all we have to do is build walls or create deterrence mechanisms, and all that does is create that crisis that I laid out, that my community has seen firsthand for decades, but it's getting worse. There really needs to be, I think, a global recognition and an adoption of global best practices, because this is not getting any better. Even with agreements made at COP27, even with historic investments in addressing the climate crisis by the United States, we are decades behind. And so we're going to continue to see that flow of humanity. And it's better, in my view, that we acknowledge they are coming anyway. How do we move them out of those terrible pathways onto better pathways? And knowing we can't take every person in the hemisphere, but that's where we need more of those global pacts, especially within each hemisphere, so that it becomes a shared responsibility, but also a shared opportunity.
So I would like to open the floor to questions. If you have a comment or a question, an insight to share, please raise your hand. A mic will come along. And also, if your question or comment is particularly at one of our panelists, please let us know. So I will look around in case there is anybody. Oh, nobody on this side. Ah, lady there, if we could please get her a mic.
Great. Thanks very much for the discussion. If you'll let me, I actually have two questions.
Sure.
Since there was no one else. My first is really for our American guest. I'm from Canada, and there has also been a lot of questions raised about the viability of the safe third country notion in migration, and whether, in the context that we are dealing with, whether this needs to be revisited. So. It's creating some issues in the Canada-U.S. relationship and deaths along our border in Canada through illegal crossings. But my question for the panel at large is, often in these conversations about migration, we talk about migrants who are actually able to cross borders. But if we look at the numbers worldwide, the vast majority of people are displaced but never cross a border. And we have very few instruments in the international community to address that problem. We have the guiding principles on internal displacement, but given climate migration and given other forms or trends that are driving migration, we have very few tools at our disposal to deal with what is actually, in a quantitative sense, a much bigger problem. So I wonder, to the degree that the panel's thought about that issue, what you think perhaps needs to be done. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. And starting with the idea of safe third countries, the pathway along our Western Hemisphere could not be more dangerous. I mean, there is, in many respects, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, there really is no safety in most of the countries leading up to the southern border, and even within our own borders in the United States, because many of these people fear being apprehended and deported, they then become victims themselves, even within the United States. They get taken advantage of, and the smuggling many times may not even happen once migrants cross the southern border into the United States. And so this is part of why these conversations are so critical. You know, the status quo makes us all less safe. And to group people together, a mother and her children, alongside and with the same label as someone who may be trying to enter the country to do us harm, that doesn't make us any safer. We have to recognize the different types of populations, and that comes with creating a far more orderly process, not just at the border, but before they even arrive at our borders, working collaboratively, cooperatively. And this is where I believe, in terms of our diplomatic work through the United States State Department, there is a lot more work that we need to do with those neighboring countries within our hemisphere.
Prime Minister, the question about those who themselves cannot cross, I mean, there are the UNHCR resettlement programs, but the quotas for most countries are quite small. But it's also a lot to put the onus on countries to receive non-citizens who are unable to do protections for themselves. Shouldn't it be the countries of origin?
I wish I had an easy answer to what is a very complicated question, but I do want to highlight something that was pointed also out by you, in the sense that the money actually spent by desperate people trying to make an illegal crossing is substantial. And there are many people who simply cannot afford to pay even $2,000, $3,000, even if they wanted to try. So even that system in its own is profoundly unjust, because at the end of the day, we're talking about people who can, take the trip, who have the physical strength to do it. If you're a single mother with a young child and you're displaced, you may not even physically be able, or you simply don't have the money to pay the smugglers. So there is, I wish I had, an answer to what you describe as being a real problem. But what I do know is that we're scratching the surface of what I think we can do as European Union in terms of offering sort of legal pathways, because these people will be required. It's the same in the U.S. with record low unemployment and growing economies. We will need to offer more people jobs, and we desperately need those people. Even in Greece, even in sectors such as tourism, which is booming, we have difficulties, finding the number of people to work. So it's not just agricultural work. It could be construction. It could be tourism. So it is imperative to have this approach. And again, there's this constant discussion, fortress Europe, fences versus non-fences. And the answer is maybe, I think it was put well by, New York Times columnist, when Tom Friedman wrote the piece about migration, he said, I want a big wall with a big door. And the answer is, you may need both. I mean, you need to be able to send a signal that you are protecting your borders. So you don't make it easy, you make it difficult. And of course, the balance of making sure that you respect fundamental rights has to be there. But the big door that he was referring to is essentially, substantial ability to welcome people, but in a legal and organized manner. Of course, there's a big complication going from what is a nice phrase to actually delivering on the ground, and this is what we are all struggling with. But what we know from our experience in Greece is, and I think the European Union is moving more towards that direction, is that border management is a part of the solution. It's not the only solution. It cannot not just be a fence, but border management has to be part of the solution. Otherwise, you will just be swamped, and you will be facing a problem which is going to become another humanitarian crisis. And at the end of the day, that's the way you break the smugglers' business model. Because if you make it difficult, people are going to think twice about engaging in the trip, because a lot of this money is paid in advance, and if you don't make it, there's no guarantee that you'll get your money back.
Sorry, did you want to comment on this?
If I am allowed?
Of course.
Two things I would like to say. First, I think it's really important is people that come irregularly, they have to pay, they have to be strong, and they have to go through a lot of really dangerous things. This is not a good way to come to the European Union. And this is what sometimes I hear in the debate, why don't we just let all the irregular in, because we might need them in the labor market. But this really sends the totally wrong signal. So that's why we need to fight the irregular migration, but then instead of legal pathways. But to be a bit more optimistic, there are more we can do if we use these legal pathways more in a political way, not just let companies pick the people they want, but actually make sure that there are legal pathways from countries that need them, actually. And we can provide also helping with education or training. So there are possibilities in countries where that's really needed, that they can send some people out to bring their salaries home, and to support UNHCR and to do with the resettlement. And this is important because most of the refugees are in countries close to, they're not in Europe, they are not in the US, they are in other areas, and we need to support them also where they are. And this is important that we take that into account when we work also with third countries.
Thank you very much. This gentleman at the back had a question. you could kindly identify yourself also.
Yeah, thank you. My name is John Mahama. I'm former president of Ghana. I was at the Valletta Summit in 2015. We reached certain agreements. How far have we been able to achieve those agreements? And I like the fact that you said migration is as old as mankind. People will seek opportunity whether they like it or not. In our own countries, we have our issues with migration. Lake Chad is 20% of what it was 30 years ago. All the families that have been displaced around Lake Chad and in the Sahel are migrating into the Gulf of Guinea countries. Our young people have no opportunities. The international economic order does not allow our countries to compete. The amount of money that flows out of Africa is far more than the amount of money that comes in. I mean, when you have a situation like this, with a continent of 1.3 billion, by 2050 it's going to be 2.5 billion. This challenge is going to get greater, not easier. How do we deal not only with building walls around our countries, but dealing with the issues that displace these people in the first place? What will make a young person want to go into a boat and cross the Mediterranean with the risk of losing his life if he can find opportunities in his own country? I think that we must look at all these in context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we'll group them together. So there's a gentleman here and then there's a lady there. So gentleman in the blue shirt, please.
Hi. So my question is for the Greek Prime Minister. And this is something that's quite close to my heart because I have a friend who's an Orthodox Christian that is wanting to move to Greece. And the question is from Turkey. And the problem with Turkey is, number one, Erdogan is seen by many others as potentially getting more authoritarian. And number two, that Turkey is potentially pursuing a geopolitical agenda that is quite separate from Europe. Do you see or do you anticipate in the coming years that Turkey will leverage or use migration as a leverage increasingly against EU and specifically Greece? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then the lady here, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Elena Lazaru. I work for the European Parliament's Research Service. My question is in the same vein as some of the others, actually. But migration is a very tangible problem. And as we've heard here, it's the issue of the day. The countries, the Commission, they're fighting day to day to find a way to manage it. But it's also a problem of the future. And you've mentioned climate change and its impact, but actually if we think of the compounded impact of the war in Ukraine and COVID, if you look at the countries where you have concentrated socioeconomic implications, food insecurity implications, and the climate change, you actually have Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Caribbean. And these are countries of huge emigration and IDPs. So my question is mostly to Commissioner Johansson, but maybe for the whole panel. This commission has put a lot of emphasis on foresight, and I wondered, how are you thinking about the day after where we have, the likelihood is we'll have more people in places like that that need to leave? And how are you working with the transatlantic partners, but also with countries like, I heard South Africa recently sees migration, incoming migration, as one of its major challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll ask you to take a question, both the root causes and how there's more of a global responsibility to deal with the issues that are driving people away from their homes, and also to answer the Turkey question.
Well, I think the honest answer to what I think is a very sort of fair assessment of what is happening in Africa is that we have not lived up to our commitments, both vis-a-vis what we wanted to do with Africa in terms of real assistance, and of course in terms of our overall ability to address the issue of climate change. And in a difficult sort of domestic situation, when we are faced with, as a prime minister of a country that's struggling with a cost of living crisis, when we're looking at the budget to always try to find, the last available euro to support our people, it takes a lot of vision and energy to understand that helping Sub-Saharan Africa is actually in our long-term interest, and these are very, very difficult problems of domestic policy making. But at least we have the commitment. We have an agenda as Europe. We had a summit with the African countries, which I think raised awareness. There's a lot more private capital that's being deployed because of the huge opportunities in Africa right now as the fastest growing continent. But we also need to be honest that quite frequently there's a lot of talk and not much substance. And frankly, if I want to be brutally honest about our, in Europe we're very good at putting labels and and nice sort of titles to big programs, and we realize that sometimes we just repackage money, which has already been committed to the budget. But this is a reality. So I would argue for less spin and more substance. Now, to your question on Turkey, what you described has already happened. It happened in March 2020 when President Erdogan actually encouraged, facilitated tens of thousands of people to cross into Europe. He was blackmailing us and threatening us for a long time that he would actually do it, and he tried to do it. And this was a time when we said, no, this is not going to happen. We protected our border. We had the whole leadership of the European institutions, President of the Commission, President of the Parliament, President of the Council at the Greek-Turkish border, saying that this blackmail is not going to materialize. We had the same problems with Lukashenko. So the playbook is there. You use desperate people, and you try to push them to gain geopolitical leverage. I think there's a better understanding now that these tactics don't work, and that is why I think we need to return to the fundamentals of our agreement with Turkey and try to work with Turkey, offer Turkey assistance. We had the discussion about safe countries. Turkey is clearly safe for Syrians. We have 4 million people living there. It's safe for Afghans. You have millions of people living there. It may not be safe. Hopefully, it won't reach the point where it won't be safe for for Turks themselves, because it needs to remain a functioning democracy. But you need to take a stand when you're clearly blackmailed. We did it with Turkey. The EU and the Baltic countries did it with Belarus and Lukashenko, and we need to make it very clear that these types of practices won't be tolerated. Plus, we need to fight, fake news and disinformation. We suffer from this. I'm not saying that we do everything perfect. It's a difficult job to manage the border, but it's very painful as Greek Prime Minister to suddenly find stories, fake stories completely. There was a story about a dead girl on a little islet on a river between the Greek and Turkish border. Suddenly, we were bombarded with negative press, and once we dig deeper, we find out, a month later, that all this was fake. It never happened. But we have suffered all the bad press in the first place. So there's a big disinformation game also taking place by those countries that are trying to instrumentalize migration. We need to be aware of that dimension as well.
And there's also the challenge of fake news and xenophobia being used by certain political parties in different parts of the world. That's another side of the weaponization of these.
At least in Greece, we're happy that we don't have an active we had a very xenophobic, almost neo-Nazi extreme right party. They're no longer in parliament, and we've actually been able to prosecute them as a criminal organization. And although people are always, it's a problem, when people see, for example, a facility in their neighborhood. I understand when you suddenly realize on an island, we had times when we had more migrants than permanent citizens on the island. So of course people get scared. Now that we've managed the problem, there's a much greater acceptance and a greater understanding that, look, at the end of the day, managed migration can be a plus, and it's not necessarily a minus. And of course, there's a big, educational component. And there's another aspect which, in Greece, we need to highlight, and that is the story of all the people who came from the Balkans. After the wall crashed, we have hundreds of thousands of Albanians who came to Greece in search of a better future. Their kids are now going to Greek schools. They can become Greek citizens, and it's a great story whenever you go to these schools and you see how well the second generation has actually been integrated into Greek society. So I think we need to talk about the positive stories as well. It's not all negative.
Can Commissioner, if you would like to comment on the question about Africa and also the sort of support that can be given for countries that are suffering, especially at a
Yes.
time of economic hardship globally.
Yes, support is needed, but not only, also the partnership, because I think that the European and the African destiny are linked to each other. So we really need each other, and that's also why we have this global gateway approach. That's why we have shifted our whole development aid approach, that we take migration into that to a certain extent, at least 10%. I think the last time I checked it was 17% of the money that we are spending that will address migration. And that is to address the root causes of migration, of course, that people are not forced to leave their country, but it's also important to see that, as I started to say, migration has always been there, and if without migration, we would probably be all dead, more or less. So it's also that people, even if they are not suffering, they would like to search also new opportunities. That's also part of being human being, that you would like to go for that or meet other people and find new, explore new opportunities and so on. And we have to take that into account. And so we are taking steps in that direction, but of course it's not enough. So I think especially when it comes to the very important relation between Europe and Africa. You mentioned the summit, for example. We have the first trip we did as a commission was to the African Union. We have a lot of things in common, but we need to work even further on that. And I think what we have on the global gateway is an important part. On the forecast, yes, we are doing that, and we see, and we can see a lot of people that probably need to flee their country, yeah? And this is what we can, but this is important that we have this comprehensive approach, so how we can support countries and how we can support neighboring countries. And if I come back to one thing, I think it's that the importance is that migration need to be part of almost all policy areas. I remember when migration is seen as something very dangerous and very difficult, and only few people should really deal with this, and others say, no, I don't want to mention migration because then things get difficult. Then we're not going to solve it, because all countries in the whole world deal with migration in one way or another. And that's the normal thing. And we only can do it better if we support each other. So I think really to de-dramatize migration issues is really an important way forward.
Thank you. Final questions before we close the panel. Yes, there's a gentleman here and a lady here. If you could please make your questions very brief.
I guess I just wanted to ask, particularly Congresswoman Escobar. We've heard a lot of very good solutions about what we should do. I was wondering what we could do, especially in the U.S., what we could do to actually reach those solutions. So what do you guys think has made the U.S. so uniquely, or the U.S. Congress so uniquely stubborn in refusing to face this humanitarian crisis?
Thank you. And lady.
Hi, my name is Rafaela Schweiger. I'm the director of the migration program at the Bosch Foundation. So I have one comment and one question. The comment is on the whole issue of climate. I'm grateful it's coming up in the discussions, because we see it already happening now, and we will see it happening more in the future. And I think exactly as you were discussing, how to address those issues in a way that that they will not become another crisis and another big crisis in also many countries of origin and in the regions where people will likely stay and will migrate. My question would be, when we're talking a lot of those pilot programs on opening up pathways for people, thinking about Germany, many other European countries, there are those tiny programs with 15 people, 20 people on health, on other issues. How do we go from from pilot to scale in terms of what the labor market needs, but also in terms of what are the countries that are probably faced by the climate crisis, that are where people would also want to move, and how do we link those issues a bit more together going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Congressman Escobar, if you can answer, well, both questions.
Absolutely. So the United States Congress has not passed immigration reform since 1986. That was the last time that the US Congress opened up legal pathways. And that was under a Republican president, Ronald Reagan. 10 years later, 1996, Congress passed new laws, Republican Congress and a Democratic president. This was President Clinton, but they shrank legal pathways. They made it so that there were permanent bars for some migrants. And that really, from my perspective, was the beginning of what has been a failed approach to immigration. And that failed approach was, let's limit legal pathways and let's focus only on the border. And you're absolutely right. It's the border and border enforcement and border policy is one component, but when you make it the only component, which is what we have done for decades in the United States, you have set the system up for failure. At the same time, our visas, when a visa expires, people have to leave the country for months before being allowed to come back in. What's an employer supposed to do? And what is that visa holder supposed to do? What about that visa holder's families? And so to the question in particular, like how do we fix this? I think it's really important for the American people to recognize it's been one political party that really has refused to vote on legal pathways. And legal pathways have to be part of the mix. They have to be part of the solution, or you're doing what we've done for the last 30 years. The last time Congress came close was in 2013. And the United States Senate, which isn't known for taking a whole lot of action, the United States Senate, on a bipartisan basis, came forward and they were ready to fund historic amounts of funding, appropriations for border security, but also legal pathways. When they passed it out of the Senate, it came to the House. And the caucus known as the Freedom Caucus, which is a far-right caucus, prevented it from getting a vote on the floor. That was 2013. But I will say, sometimes with these slim margins, which is what we have today, the Republicans have control of the House, very slim margin, sometimes there are opportunities in that. And I have reached across the aisle to my Republican colleagues to look for bipartisan solutions. This is going to have to be bipartisan. We don't have dramatic majorities in either the House or the Senate, so we've got to get this done in a bipartisan basis. But I am an eternal optimist, and I do think that there is an opportunity among those moderate Republicans who truly want a solution. I think there are huge swaths of the opposing party, of the Republican Party, who like the chaos that comes with not solving the challenge that we have, and it is indeed one of the greatest challenges we face as a country today. But I still have hope, and I think there is a path with some of those moderate Republicans.
Commissioner, how do we scale up the pilot programs?
Yes, this is really frustrating, because when some member states, well, or also from the Commission, when we say, well, here we have a legal pathways for 15 people or 30 people, it's nothing. And at the same time, I know that every year 1 million migrants are coming legally to work in the European Union. And when I sum up the needs in the member states for the coming years, it's probably between 0.5 and 1 million more for the coming years for labor migration. But then they have this shift that labor migration is one thing, and then we have political projects for legal pathways. But labor migration is a legal pathway, so we should, package this, and that will also show for our partner countries that yes, we are welcoming people, and this we should do also on a European level. It's not about having a European jurisdiction of the decision, but a little bit more showing actually the opportunities that are there, and also talk to our partner countries. Well, what would they also ask, so we do not do the brain drain or the cherry picking that will also cause problems in the countries of origin, so that we can deal with this together. I think this is not rocket science. We can do this.
Prime Minister, final word to you. We have some optimism. It can be done, but also politics often gets in the way.
Politics always gets in the way, and I think no matter how difficult it is to to get the sort of bipartisan consensus that you need. But again, let me end where I started, that at least within our political sort of European family, there seems to be a better understanding about the necessary balance between providing frontline states with support and managing the border effectively, and making sure that we open up legal pathways to migration, but we also do returns, because there will be always a number of people who get to Europe and will not be entitled to asylum. And if they know that they can find a way to stay, then there'll be more people who know that they are embarking on a journey for economic reasons and not because their life is threatened, not because of fleeing war and persecution. So we need to get three aspects of the triangle, plus addressing the root causes, which is, of course, a much more overwhelming, much more sort of overarching long-term solution, not a solution, but at least an attempt to address the root causes of migration.
So a lot to take into account. One of the things that threw me is that the UN Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, a mouthful, but really was supposed to tackle this. So we had the UN Compact, member states signed on it, but we are very far from implementation. Thank you for your insights and for being so frank and candid with us. We've learned a lot today. Thank you all for your attendance, and have a good rest of your weekend here at Munich.